Afternoon, America. Brian James Blem here on to welcome you back to another episode of What the Fuck's Up. What do I want to talk to you about today? I want to talk to you a little bit about the pressing issue of the day, right? A vast, overwhelming majority of Americans support voter identification to give more security in our elections. And that includes over 70% of Democrats. And we have Congress, all of these rhinos in Congress that are impeding progress of us achieving that goal as a people. Every country around the world uses some form of voter ID. In the United States, that's not required. It really depends on your state or locality. And so we're gonna take a look at Maricopa County and how voter ID is simply a farce, right? Because there are ways around voters having to go to the polls to show their identification before they get a ballot. And that would be with the system of mail-in voting. And so I want to explain that process a little bit to you and how voter identity theft happens and has been happening and how it can negatively impact your elections, your right to choose who represents you in running our government, whether it be the federal government and the president and members of Congress, or whether it be a state legislature, your governor, your secretary of state, or your attorney general, or whether it be your city council, or whether, they do these mass mail out ballots elections for tax increases or for other bond issues, right? And so elections have ramifications, folks. And so your ability to govern, who elects who is significantly negatively impaired by who is actually voting in your elections, whether they're allowed to or not, whether some people get two ballots that they can vote at, because this is actually what's happening in our system. But if you look at Maricopa County as an example, there are 2,555,386 people listed as active voters currently in Maricopa County. 1,975,102 are on the active early voting list, the AVOL list. That means, right, they may or may not have shown an ID when they registered to vote, because we have much of our registration taking place through these non-governmental organizations who have carte blanche access to the voter registration database, right? Arizona Revised Statute 16-186, I believe, F, talks about, who can, have access to the voter registration information. And one of the people are NGOs. They are given access for any purpose. And so that's problematic, folks, because who knows if they're showing identification when they're registering people to vote. Not to mention the fact, in my last episode, I talked about the Zips issue, right? Zips was raided. They found several illegal immigrants upon information and belief using forged, false documentation to prove their eligibility to work in the United States. And if the illegal immigrant cartel organizations and NGOs that are pushing these people through the U.S. economy want them to register to vote, why can't they also register them to vote? It's a simple step. You're violating this law, what's the difference? You violate this law, right? So it doesn't matter to some people. The only thing that matters is the acquisition of power. And that's what the debate is about the voter registration database, right? Are Americans choosing their elected representatives, or are illegal immigrants and others who should not be allowed to vote throwing the curve in favor of one political party and its candidates or another? And so I don't want to get off on too big of a tangent, but following the 2020 election, We the People Arizona Alliance was retained by the Arizona Senate to conduct a sort of audit, if you will, of the signatures that were verified by then Secretary of State Adrian Fontes to determine how many of these are bad, right? And because the problem is this, folks. This is 77% of all Maricopa County voters will never have to show identification to vote. They are simply mailed a ballot. And in 2020, based on Maricopa County's own documents, Adrian Fontes mailed 2 ballots for every voter. That's roughly 4 million ballots floating around out there in the world for people to gather up. And then the signature verification process. What happens is the identity of these mail-in voters becomes the signature on the affidavit envelope. You get people like Mark Elias who say, oh, signature verification should not even happen, right? Democrats do not want signature verification. And that's essentially what Adrian Fontes did in 2020. And so if we look at, the study conducted by We the People of Arizona's signature verification process in 2020, they found that approximately 10% of all of those signatures verified were completely bad, right? Just absolutely no question about it. Fraudulent signatures, right? So let's say you sign your name like this. And the signature verifier hired by Maricopa County to verify signatures approves a signature that looks like this. Clearly, the 2 people signing this ballot affidavit envelope are not the same people. But Maricopa County went a step further. And it's my understanding still goes a step further. And this is why I have labeled this process voter identity theft, right? What does Maricopa County do with this signature after somebody approves it and they open the envelope and they count the ballot? They add this signature to the voter's registration record so that when people are conducting signature verification in the future, this signature, this identity of the voter, which is clearly erroneous, becomes a valid signature to identify this voter's ballot in the future. That's a problem, folks. 10% of this active early voting list is 197,510 ballot affidavit envelope signatures. That is way more than enough to throw any election on the ballot unless you have this extreme runaway election. And I don't think I've ever seen a runaway election by those numbers, right? And so this can be a tool to throw city council races. It can be a tool to throw any other type of race because you have very few checks and balances on this system, right? They print all of these ballots, sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 per voter. They drop them in the mail. And then who gets them? The United States Postal Service, a highly partisan organization that in every election cycle I have seen for a very long period of time endorses and works on behalf of Democrats up and down the ticket. And that's regardless of which of the 2 labor unions represent the Postal Service, right? We literally turn over 77% of our ballots to an organization that is actively partisan and expect a fair outcome, right? That's part of the problem, folks. There are no political party observers watching what's happening with these ballots while they're in the Postal Service's possession. In the 2020 election, the Democrats worked very effectively to minimize, right? You had this whole group of postal people working in the postal centers. What did the Democrats do? They took and they made a very small group, a very small elite group of people responsible for all early ballots instead of this large group of people who could have overseen what was actually taking place with mail-in ballots. And whenever you centralize a system like that, folks, and you remove people from the process, you subject it to an increased probability of fraud. And that's just what happens, folks. When you have no oversight over these small groups of people that are highly partisan, who knows what's going to happen? Right? When you run signature verification programs that approve erroneous signatures, because Democrats don't even want to run signature verification. In fact, Adrian Fontes, we have learned from We the People USA Alliance, after analysis of the 2020 data, didn't even do signature verification on just about 100% of all of the mail-in ballots, right? They got their dream, they got their goal, and then they added these signatures to the voter's file, thereby changing their identity, right? And still today, what does not Maricopa County do? If your signature is not approved and they call you to cure your ballot, right? That's what they do. They text you or they call you. They say, did you vote a ballot? Let's say you're one of these two people in 2020 or 2022 under Stephen Richer, who was also mailing out duplicate ballots to lots of people. Let's say they call you and say, did you vote? And you say, yes, I did vote, right? Well, you did vote, but there are two ballots, right? And so what they don't do is they don't send you a copy of the signature. They have it. It's digitized, right? That's how they validate it and verify it's either good or bad. They do not send you the signature and say, hey, voter, is this you? And that is a problem, folks. That is a huge problem. And the bigger problem is we're changing the identity of millions of people who are registered to vote, who will never again have to show identification to vote because they get a ballot sent to them in the mail each and every election cycle, whether they're alive, dead, moved, whatever the case may be. This is a huge problem, folks, because it allows nefarious forces to unduly interfere with our elections by taking this process away from us, by not requiring proper identification, and by simply instituting a system that allows for the identity of voters to be changed over time. And with that, I'm going to say you need to be active. You need to call your senator. You need to call Senator Murkowski and tell her to get off her throne, right? To get off her throne and to support the SAVE Act, which would require at least some modicum of voter identification. But this system is extremely flawed, and it is very, very destructive of any type of democratic process we might think we have in the United States. And with that, I say peace.